A few months ago, I made the video about the pros and cons of using the iPad Pro with LumaFusion for your video editing workflow. And in that video, I promised I would make another video about my photography workflow using the iPad Pro and Lightroom CC. So this is that video. I will talk to you about the pros and the cons, and at the end of the video, I'll tell you my workflow for importing, editing, and most importantly, managing my photos using the iPad Pro, Lightroom CC, and either a Mac or a PC with Lightroom CC Classic. Because as I'll get into the list, there's a few things that you still can't do just with the Lightroom CC, either on a portable device or on the desktop. If you haven't seen my LumaFusion video where I go over the reasons why I got the iPad Pro and all the peripherals and accessories that I got with it in more detail, you can click up here now to watch that before continuing on with this video, because I feel like there's some information in there that might be helpful for you. If you're new around here, my name is Andreas. I make videos about photography and travel and sometimes gear. But right now, let's get into the list. Let's start with the positive. Let's start with the pros. And the most obvious one is that using the iPad to edit photos is, believe it or not, much faster than using a desktop or a laptop, especially if you're using Lightroom CC Classic. Now, if you don't know the difference between Classic and just CC, basically Lightroom CC is the newer version that Adobe has been developing that is meant to be replacing Lightroom CC Classic eventually. But while there are still features that you can't use on Lightroom CC, they have kept Classic around so you can go and do those features. However, it is much more sluggish to use than the brand new Lightroom CC. And Lightroom CC is both on PC, Mac, iPads, iPhones. It's basically how they're trying to unify their app for different platforms. But back to my first pro, importing photos, going through them to select what you want to reject and what you want to keep, and then actually editing pictures is so much faster on the iPad. And this is because when you're using Lightroom CC Classic, when you're importing your photos on a laptop or a desktop, it wants to create previews. You can set it to create minimum previews or one-to-one previews, which is basically going to try to render the entire image, or even smart previews, which are much smaller files that you can use and edit even if your photos, your actual original copies aren't connected to your computer, which is basically what Lightroom CC on the iPad and the iPhone does, which is create smart previews. But when importing on the iPad, it does it automatically super fast. I don't really need to go into so much detail, but what you need to take away from this point is that it's much faster on the iPad. As you can see here on my PC laptop, when you're in the edit mode, if I want to go to the next picture and start editing, it takes a bit of time to load. And again, if you haven't built full previews, when you import, you can't zoom in instantly and have the image be very clear automatically. If you haven't built one-to-one previews, when you zoom in, you won't have a clear picture until it loads the original photo. And if you don't have the original photo and you're just using smart previews to edit, then it will never load the full thing. So if you're trying to do little edits when you're zoomed in and you want to see the clear picture, that's a no-go unless you have one-to-one previews. Now this happens on the iPad as well. If you're just working off smart previews from the cloud, then you won't be able to zoom in and have a super clear picture. But again, we'll get into that in the workflow section of the video. The good thing on the iPad is that you can basically go through the pictures really fast, select which ones you want, reject which ones you don't, delete your rejected. And to edit, you just wait 1 to 3 seconds for it to load the image, which is surprisingly fast if you've ever tried to edit on a desktop or a laptop. And you have full control over all the edits without waiting anymore and without any lag. You can just drag your finger on the sliders and everything works super snappy. Same with zooming in and out and rotating and cropping. Everything just works like butter. Number 2 pro is that you have this lovely little tool here called the Apple Pencil, which comes in very handy, especially when you want to do fine-tuned selections and you want to draw stuff. And of course, you can have a Wacom tablet for your computer, but it's much more expensive, and unless you have the screen one, it's not the same as editing right on what you're looking at. I think the Apple Pencil is a big bonus for the iPad Pro. Now I keep saying iPad Pro, but This workflow works with all the iPads, especially the brand new iPad Air that Apple has just announced, which is basically like the iPad Pro but cheaper. And of course, it can work like this on the iPhone as well. Pro number 3, and the number one reason that I bought the iPad to use for my photo editing, is that it's super portable. You can just take it out of the case if you want, and you have it here. You can just love it for when I travel. It is super light, comfortable to hold, and just the fact that it's tactile, and that when you're editing a picture, you're basically doing your edits on the picture rather than somewhere else with the mouse. It makes a big difference. It sounds like a big hokey pokey, but it makes you want to edit your pictures a lot more when you have it so tactile. So yeah, portability, big plus. And that connects to Pro number 4, which is it's a lot more fun to use than a conventional laptop or desktops, which will make you want to edit more and actually enjoy the process of going through your pictures and looking at them, you know, in your hands and editing them. And finally, for Pro number 5, is that the entire iPad and Lightroom CC architecture is based on the fact that everything will be going into the cloud soon, if not already. And you can basically import your photos on one device and then continue editing on another. It's seamless, it's fun, it's fast, and once you've imported your photos and those photos are synced in the cloud, you can't lose them unless you really screw up what you do and you delete from everything. Now, those are the pros for using the iPad and Lightroom CC in my opinion. Now I'm going to go on to the cons, and again, like my LumaFusion video, the cons are a few more, but they're more minor and specific, because these are things that I'm missing from when I was using a computer, so I can go more in depth in features that I'm missing. So saying that, I'm going to start with a bit of a vague con, which is my number one issue, is that the workflow is a bit sketchy still. It's not ironed out the way it is on a computer. You know, Lightroom has been around for years and years on computers. So basically, if you're coming from a computer-based workflow where you want to know where your files are, where you want to know how to back up your files in physical hard drives, then you'll have a bit of a hard time because I don't even know where the files are kept, the actual photo files are kept in the iPad, and how to access them and how to back them up. I'm going to touch on this, the workflow part again at the end of the video, but if you're coming thinking that it's going to be the same way that you used to work, then I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but it's not. It's going to be a bit different, but again, these sacrifices come with a major benefit of speed, consistency, and comfort in other ways. So have an open mind is what I'm trying to say. Now let's go into the more specific features that I like to use that aren't in the iPad yet and in Lightroom CC. And let's start with the maps and the geotagging. I don't know about you, but I like to geotag all my photos to be able to see them on the map when I travel. That is really fun for me to be able to see where I've been and where I've taken the pictures. And then when I export them to share them on socials, the geotagging is already there for me, and I don't have to start, you know, searching for the place and trying to remember where I took the picture. As of making this video, it's October 2020, and Lightroom CC on the iPad still doesn't have a map function. You can search by location, but you can't actually tag your pictures if they haven't been tagged automatically by your camera. So I am planning on making a video about how I do the whole geotagging my photos at some point, so if you want to watch that, let me know down in the comments. I have a specific workflow for that works for me. My camera doesn't have a GPS, so I have to do it differently. So if you want to see that, let me know. So this is something that I go back to my Mac Mini for. Thankfully, like I said, because it's cloud-based, all my photos get synced up to my Lightroom catalog on the computer. Then I add the geotags there, and then obviously that syncs up through all my devices as well and goes back into the photos in iPad. Again, I will go into more detail about that in the workflow part of the video. Another feature I like to use in Lightroom CC Classic is the spot preview. Basically, when you have a lot of dust on your sensor and there's spots on your pictures that you want to remove, there's this little setting in Lightroom Classic where you can press to be able to visualize where the spots are on your picture, so you can use spot removal and remove them. This feature doesn't exist yet on the Lightroom CC app on the iPad, so you can basically only remove the really visible spots. which might be okay because it means it's saving you time for worrying about spots that aren't really visible. But if I'm looking to print out a picture, I want to be sure that I've taken out all the little tiny spots from my pictures and all that dust I need to get rid of. So I wish they will add this soon. This brings me on to the next point, which is general spot removal or any kind of removal workflow. It was never really that good in Lightroom on the desktop or otherwise, and I often found myself needing to go to Photoshop if I wanted to, let's say, remove somebody that was photobombing me in my picture. And that used to work quite well on the computer because you could just right click, send to Photoshop, do like content aware fill of what you wanted to remove, and then if you save the picture, it just brought that picture back into Lightroom automatically. This isn't the case on the iPad, as you might imagine. There is a new Photoshop that is much more powerful than what used to exist with other apps in the iPad, but I like to use Photoshop Fix for this kind of thing on the iPad, which is actually really good for removing stuff from pictures. As you can see here, this picture was full of people that I wanted to remove, and it did a really good job at removing them. But again, it's not as straightforward as sending it over from Lightroom and then sending it back. You have to basically save it and then re-imported it manual. It's not a big deal. I don't do this very often, so I wouldn't say it's a deal breaker, and since there's a workaround, I'm happy with that. The next thing that I'm missing is the ability to select your lens profile. So in Lightroom Classic CC, there's a little drop-down menu where you can select what lens you've been using, and then it will automatically correct distortion and vignetting that lens might be creating. This is not a very big deal for when you're using a regular lens that doesn't have much distortion, but if you're using something like super wide, like this Samyang 14mm lens, which basically if I'm shooting a landscape that has a horizon, the horizon looks like a big W because of the distortion that it creates. You can't correct that manually. You can only correct that by using the lens profile that they've created to correct for that distortion, and that doesn't happen automatically on the iPad and Lightroom CC. So I basically have to wait for that to sync, go to my desktop and click that little drop down and select the lens that I'm using for that to correct. Like I said, it's not a big deal when using a regular lens that doesn't have much distortion, but for this, specifically for this lens, I have to do it, otherwise it looks very warpy. Next up, we have the ability to create panoramas, or lack thereof. Basically, you can't now select multiple pictures that you might have taken in order to stitch in a panel. You can't do that in Lightroom CC. Again, I have to go to a desktop and do it, or use one of the many other apps that are available on the iPad that can do that. However, on Lightroom CC Classic on a desktop or a laptop, you can merge raw images into a panel and it will be a raw image at the end of the stitching, which is not something that other apps can do, at least from what I'm aware of. So that is, again, something that I go back to my desktop to do. This brings me to the next stitching problem that you find, and this is the lack of ability to do an HDR stitch in Lightroom CC on the iPad. I sometimes like to shoot multiple exposures and then combine them into one. That is called a high dynamic range image. Basically, at this point, again, you can't do that on the iPad, so again, I go back to the desktop for that. And to be honest, Lightroom CC Classic is much better at all of these stitching operations because you can also do an HDR panel. You can basically shoot bracketed images one after the other and then stitch the bracketing and the panorama at the same time, which is quite amazing, and I really hope they bring that over to Lightroom CC. Enough with the stitching, let's go to the next feature that I've been missing, and this is the ability to select based on luminance or color. Let's say you have a very bright sky in your image and you want to do a gradient filter to darken that sky. And there's buildings in between or mountains that you don't want to affect. What you can do in Lightroom CC Classic is drag a graduated filter, and then down here you can range mask based off of color or luminance, which basically allows you to select just the really bright parts or just the dark parts or just this color or just that color and make finer edits to the image like that. I really like this tool and I really want to use it more often, but I don't have that option yet. So keep that in mind. One other thing is that you can't have your original images on an external hard drive and edit off that external hard drive. When you import stuff into your Lightroom catalog on the iPad, it will copy everything into the app, and that is where it will keep it until you delete those pictures from within the app. So make sure if you want to buy an iPad to do your photo editing and you have very big RAW files and you take a lot of pictures, make sure you account for that when you're choosing your internal hard drive storage space. My next con has more to do about the iPad's hardware than Lightroom, and I found that when I'm using intensive apps on the iPad, especially with Lightroom and LumaFusion, if the device starts getting hot, then the screen brightness will drop off automatically, and you will notice that the screen is not as bright as it used to until the device cools down, and then it will pop back to the normal brightness. Especially if you have the brightness on max all the time like I do, you will see that this happens quite often. Now, I haven't seen anybody else talk about this. I haven't read anything about it, but this happens on my iPhone as well when I'm editing. I will have my screen brightness at full, and I can feel the device getting warm, and then it just gets darker. This is rather annoying, especially when you want to do exposure edits and you want to make sure that it's consistent throughout everything. If you're editing one picture and then you go to the next and the screen brightness drops by half, because I think that's what it does, then it's hard to gauge. So remember that the histogram is your friend, and try to use the histogram if that happens to you, like I try to do. And then finally, another hardware software issue is that, especially when you're using a keyboard, there aren't that many keyboard shortcuts as there are on a regular computer. So that's it for my pros and cons list. I hope this will help make up your mind if you're looking to buy an iPad for your photography. We'll jump onto the workflow now, which will hopefully answer any other questions that you may have. This is the workflow that I found works best for me and my preferences. If you guys have a different workflow that you think is better, let me know down below, because I always look to improve and get faster workflows and try to spend less time editing and more time shooting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to describe a regular day of shooting when I go traveling, because that's the reason why I got the iPad, for when I'm traveling. Basically, I start my day by taking pictures, of course. So first you take your pictures, then what I do is I take my SD card when I get back home at the end of the day, and I drop off all my pictures onto the iPad through Lightroom. So I have a little dongle here from Hyperdrive. This is quite pricey, but I really like it because it matches the iPad aesthetics. It has all the ports that you might need, SD card, micro SD. So basically, I just put that into the iPad and I open Lightroom and import all the pictures. Now you will find that when you're importing stuff into Lightroom, you can't minimize the app, but now that iPad OS has multitasking, you can open something else on the side if you really want to do something at the same time. After all my pictures are imported, they will automatically start syncing with the cloud. Obviously you have to pay for Adobe Cloud if you want to have good amount of storage. The next step after I import is to cull through all my images. I'll basically go through all my images and select the ones that I want to reject, the ones that are out of focus, I accidentally took. If there's too many of the same, I'll reject them and I'll delete them, and then I start editing. I try to do basic edits on all the pictures that I take, cropping, straightening horizons, adding presets, or adding some contrast and color, and make sure exposures are good. When I'm happy with all the edits that I've done, I've gotten rid of all the really bad pictures and everything has synced up into the cloud, and I'm back home. I will sit on my computer, open Lightroom CC Classic, and that is where I do my geotagging of all the pictures, and that is where I do any panos that I need to do. That is where I do any HDRs that I need to do, and that is where I select my lens profiles for the lenses that really need it. Like I said before, for the spot removal or the general removal, if I'm in a hurry, I will use Photoshop Fix on the iPad. Otherwise, I will wait until I get home and use the proper Photoshop with Content Aware fill to do an even better job. And at this stage, my photos are export ready. Basically, all my photos are synced in the cloud with all the edits that I've done on the computer. The panos and the HDRs that I've done, they basically create a new image that I have to throw back into the all synced images. I go back into my iPad and I export all the pictures in JPEG with all metadata on super high resolution into my photos library. And this is my backup photo library. I have all the pictures that I've ever taken in my iCloud library as JPEGs, and those are synced through all my Apple devices. So I have basically 150,000 pictures on my cloud, which is also something that I pay for extra space. But you will know that sometimes hard drives crash, sometimes you just lose pictures, and I just want to be comfortable that at least the JPEG version exists somewhere at all times, because I have been burned before. And then once those are done, I make sure to go to my desktop to back up the raw pictures. Like I said, on the iPad, you can't really access those raw pictures anymore unless you export them from inside the Lightroom app to a hard drive, and I'm not quite sure if that actually exports the raw with the edits. So what I do is I go to my desktop, I go to the folder where I've set up for the synced photos to be downloaded from. Lightroom basically automatically downloads all the raw pictures, the original raw pictures, to this folder that you can set from the settings, and I select all the pictures and I drag them to a new folder that I rename based on year and location. And that's the folder that I have set up to be backed up into my hard drives and into my cloud and into another cloud-based backup. Once I'm comfortable that those files have been backed up at least twice, that is when I go into the iPad and I delete the pictures from Lightroom CC, which is the best way that I found to get rid of the images from the device, and also Adobe Cloud. Once you remove them from the iPad, they will disappear from your all synced photographs on the Lightroom CC Classic app on your desktop, and they will just exist in that folder where you copied them on your hard drive, on your desktop, and then on your backups. I hope that makes sense to you. If it doesn't, let me know in the comments. I'll be happy to clarify and reply to you there. Like I said, it is a bit of a sketchy workflow, but it's what I found works best for me, and it's what makes me comfortable to be able to say that my pictures are in multiple places at the same time and safe from being lost, which is, like I said, something that has happened to me in the past, so I don't want that repeated. And yeah, that's it for this video. I hope it helped you make up your mind whether you want to go on the iPad or not for your photo editing. I sure as hell don't regret it at all. I love editing my pictures on the iPad. I love taking this thing around when I travel. It's so much faster than having a computer with me. And I look forward to reading your comments. If you enjoyed this video, give me a thumbs up. Consider subscribing for more videos in the future. And thanks so much for watching.